true generosity is giving without expecting anything in return. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. The town of Havenwood clung to existence at the edge of the world, a place where roads dissolved into mere suggestions after the first rain, and winter lingered indecently long, bleaching the horizon until your eyes ached. Life in Havenwood was simple. They plowed, they sowed, they drank on holidays, and on weekdays they simply survived. And there was no place there for people like Arthur. From childhood, he was different. Awkward, thin-boned, with a perpetually distracted gaze that wandered somewhere beyond the dusty streets and leaning fences. He wasn't drawn to fights over a handful of cherries or the endless, pointless games of war. His world was in the old town library, a tiny room smelling of musty paper and dreams. He could sit for hours, lost in books about distant lands, about stars, about people capable of changing the world. He was especially captivated by stories about doctors, people who saw right through a person, fixed what was broken, brought back to life. It seemed akin to magic in a world where any cold could turn into a tragedy, and a broken bone could put an end to a whole life. But Havenwood didn't believe in magic. They believed in the power of the fist, and the heaviest fist, the loudest laugh, and the cruelest tongue belonged to Jack. Big, brash, he was the king of the playground, and later, the whole town. His amusement was picking out the weak and tormenting them, savoring their fear and humiliation. Arthur became his favorite target, the thin-boned bookworm with books under his arm. What could be a better object of ridicule? Jack didn't just tease. He broke things, broke possessions, broke games, broke spirits. The most terrible day was a cold autumn one when the whole town gathered for the county fair. Arthur had won an old anatomy book in the school quiz bowl, a real treasure for him. His happiness knew no bounds. But Jack and his buddies intercepted him on the outskirts. They snatched the book, threw it into the mud, laughed at his tears. And then Jack, with a wide grin, pushed him. Just a push. But Arthur fell so badly he heard a crack. Blood flooded his face, pain shot through his body. The worst part wasn't the pain, but Jack's expression, pure, undiluted malice, the triumph of superiority. And around them, indifferent townspeople, or those who looked away. No one helped. No one. In that moment, something inside Arthur broke too. Broke, but didn't die. Instead, it hardened, turning into a core, into cold determination. Lying in the dust, swallowing clumps of mud salty with blood and tears, he watched their retreating backs and whispered to himself, "I will leave. I will become a doctor. I will become someone who fixes what's broken. Someone strong not with fists, but with knowledge." It wasn't just a dream, it was a pledge to himself, a pledge fueled by hatred for the helplessness he had endured. The following years were hell. School in the nearby town, miles walked each way, cramming until midnight by the light of a kerosene lamp, mockery from those who didn't understand his ambitions, the constant feeling of hunger and cold. Loneliness became his faithful companion. He had no friends, no support, only the goal, etched by the pain of that day. He studied with obsession. Chemistry, biology, physics. Each subject was a step towards another life, towards a world where right wasn't determined by strength, but by knowledge and skill. Getting into medical school felt like a resurrection. The big city, bright lecture halls, people just as obsessed with science. But even here, among the intelligent and talented, the ghost of Havenwood wouldn't let him go. He saw it in every harsh word, every arrogant glance, every manifestation of injustice. It made him tougher, more demanding of himself and others. He became one of the best students, not through talent, but through the curse that drove him forward. Hours in the library, sleepless nights over textbooks, practice until exhaustion. He wasn't just learning to be a doctor. He was learning to build a wall between himself and the past, a wall made of knowledge, confidence, and cold focus. The operating room became his sanctuary. Here, amidst the sterile cleanliness and precise instruments, he felt truly alive. Origins, past, social status didn't matter here. Only knowledge of anatomy, steadiness of hand, and clarity of thought mattered. And with every patient saved, every successful operation, that wall grew stronger. He became Dr. Arthur Vance, a respected, promising surgeon, a man who had left Havenwood far behind, or so it seemed. But the past, as we know, knows how to wait, and it knows how to wait where you least expect it, on the operating table. The air in the operating room smelled sharp and clean, iodine, alcohol, ozone from the running equipment. The cold, even light of the lamps mercilessly highlighted every object, every detail. Arthur stood at the scrub sink, meticulously washing his hands according to protocol. His movements were honed to automaticity, becoming part of him over years of practice, confident, precise, without a single wasted gesture. Today was his first solo operation as the lead surgeon, a long-awaited, hard-won step. He felt both colossal tension and a sharp, almost physical readiness. Readiness to apply all his knowledge, all his skills, to save a life. In the adjacent pre-op room, the patient was being prepared. The duty nurse, a young intern, nervously fiddled with the edge of her scrubs. The anesthesiologist, the experienced Dr. Evans, calmly checked the equipment. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Life in the hospital is always a plan, a protocol, a sequence of actions designed to bring order to the chaos of pain and suffering. Arthur breathed deeply, trying to find his usual pre-surgery rhythm, focus bordering on a trance. The nurse entered the OR pushing a gurney. Beneath the sheet, the silhouette of a person was visible. The patient's face was half hidden by an oxygen mask, but something in the contours, the broad forehead, the shape of the nose, the hard line of the jaw, made Arthur tense, faintly familiar. Patient Jack Peterson, admitted for acute appendicitis, complicated by peritonitis, the nurse reported quietly, checking the chart. Arthur's heart skipped a beat, or two, or stopped altogether for a fraction of a second. Jack Peterson. That name, heard here, in the sterile silence of the operating room, was like a bomb exploding, an icy wave crashing over him. Time compressed into a single point, the moment when, as a small, frightened boy, his nose was broken, and along with it, his illusion of safety and justice. He couldn't move. An image flashed before his eyes, a muddy autumn road, scattered book pages, laughter. Jack's cruel, triumphant laughter, the pain of the blow, the taste of blood in his mouth, the feeling of absolute helplessness. And that look, empty, cruel, without a shadow of doubt or compassion. The very look that had haunted him for years. Now, years later, that person lay before him on the operating table, eyelids closed, defenseless under anesthesia. The one who embodied his childhood fears, who had knocked him out of his ordinary life, who, unknowingly, had pushed him onto this path, now lay completely dependent on his skills, on his hands. Arthur's inner world shuddered. Voices from the past reared their heads, gloating. See? Now you can get revenge. You can inflict pain. You can give it all back to him. The whisper of old pain, old grievances was insistent, almost physically palpable. He saw not a patient before him, but his tormentor, the one who had caused him so much pain, so much humiliation. His hands, just moments ago ready to perform the miracle of salvation, suddenly felt alien. Could they touch this body with the same cool precision? Could his mind remain clear when the source of his nightmares lay before him? Dr. Evans, noticing Arthur's momentary freeze, cast a quick, searching glance his way. "Dr. Vance, everything all right?" Arthur swallowed. His throat was dry. His gaze swept over the patient's face, the bruises under the eyes, the slightly swollen eyelids. A human life. It hung by a thread, weighed down by peritonitis. This wasn't the town bully Jack anymore. This was patient J. Peterson, 45 years old, with an acute abdomen. The professionalism he had built brick by brick over long years demanded a response. The voice of his mentor, an old professor, echoed in his head. "A surgeon has no right to emotions in the operating room. Your hands are instruments. Your mind is a map. And before you is a life. Someone else's life entrusted to you. Regardless of who this person is, he needs your help." This wasn't just a test of professionalism. It was a test of his entire journey. Everything he had suffered to be here. The easiest thing would be to step back, to say he felt unwell, that there was a conflict of interest, to walk away and leave this man to another doctor. But was this why he had spent thousands of hours with books, assisting at the operating table? Was this why he had fled Havenwood, to become someone who fixes what's broken? If he walked away now, he would remain that frightened boy with the broken nose. He would let the past win. He would let pain and hatred dictate his actions. But he had built his life not against someone, but in spite of everything, to become better, to be strong, not to hurt, but to help. The decision came not as a flash of insight, but as a cold, hard stone settling at the bottom of his soul. Heavy, inevitable. He was a doctor, and before him was a patient. Everything else, the pain, the grudges, the past of Havenwood, Jack's laughter, remained outside the operating room doors. Right now, only one thing mattered: saving this life. He pulled on the sterile gloves. The material rustled, fitting snugly over his hands, the very hands that had once trembled in fear before this man. Now they were calm and steady. Not a muscle twitched on his face. He turned towards the table. "Instruments ready?" His voice was even, slightly hoarse, but perfectly professional. "Ready, Dr. Vance," the nurse replied. Dr. Evans nodded. He asked nothing, but his gaze lingered on Arthur's face a fraction longer than usual. Did he see something? Maybe, but it didn't matter now. Arthur looked at the defenseless face on the operating table. There was nothing in it of the powerful, arrogant teenager he remembered. Only pallor, signs of illness, vulnerability. This was the first challenge, the main challenge, a challenge to his own humanity, his past, his pain. And Arthur accepted it, choosing a path that would forever change not only the life of the man lying before him, but also his own. He raised the scalpel. The operation began. The surgery lasted a long time. Hours crawled by, filled with focused whispers, the clink of instruments, the rhythmic beeping of monitors. The world narrowed to the illuminated field, to the vulnerable flesh beneath the scalpel, to the thin line between life and death that Arthur held in his hands. He worked with the same flawless precision, the same cold calculation as always. No one on the team could have suspected the storm raging inside him. Outwardly, he was the perfect surgeon, calm, confident, in command. But inside, every incision, every clamp echoed in the most painful corner of his memory. His hands did their work, while his mind, split in two, battled the flood of memories. When it was all over, when patient Peterson was transferred to the ICU and the surgical team began to disperse, Arthur felt his strength leave him. The adrenaline subsided, leaving behind emptiness and a tremor. He removed his gloves, then his mask. The cold air of the OR felt suffocating. He looked at his hands, a savior's hands, a surgeon's hands. They had just returned life to the man who had once nearly taken his own. It was a victory of professionalism, a victory of duty. But why did it feel like a defeat? He left the operating room and walked down the corridor. Hospital corridors always seemed like labyrinths to him, but today the feeling was especially acute. Where to go? Where was his place? The world outside the sterile zone suddenly seemed alien, hostile. He didn't go home. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in the residence lounge. The light was dim, the air stale. He sat there for a long time, hours merging into one sluggish period. There were no thoughts in his head, only a chaos of images and sounds from the past. Jack's laughter, the crunch of bone, a boy's cry. Everything he had so painstakingly suppressed for years returned with tenfold force. The wall he had built so long and diligently, the wall of knowledge, discipline, professional detachment, developed a deep crack. Hiding behind it was that same frightened, hurt child from Havenwood. And now that child was crying out loud, drowning out the reason of the grown man. His life, so orderly, so purposeful, began to crumble. Work, which had been his refuge, his meaning, became the place where his past caught up with him. He could no longer look at patients as mere collections of tissues and organs. In every face, he imagined features of someone from Havenwood, someone from his nightmares. He became withdrawn, avoided colleagues, skipped lunches in the cafeteria, locked himself in his office. His usually flawless concentration wavered. He began to make small, insignificant errors that were previously unthinkable for him. Once he mixed up patient charts. Another time, he forgot an important detail in a medical history. It was terrifying. Terrifying to realize that the pain you thought buried could destroy even the most honed skills. His hands, his pride, sometimes began to tremble. Not from fatigue, but from internal tension. Sleep turned into torture. Nightmares returned him to that muddy road, forcing him to relive the humiliation and pain over and over. He would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding furiously, and for a long time couldn't figure out where he was, in his comfortable city apartment or still there, in the dust of Havenwood. His personal life, already not very eventful, all his energy went into work, completely vanished. A few attempts to start relationships ended in nothing. He was too cold, too detached, too absorbed in his internal struggle. Now he simply stopped answering calls, canceled rare meetings. Loneliness became total, all-consuming. Before, it was simply the absence of others. Now it was a heavy burden on his soul, the impossibility of sharing his pain with anyone. He was alone with his demons. He started losing weight. Food tasted bland. His gaze grew dull. Shadows settled under his eyes. The mirror reflected a stranger, haggard, lost, with eyes full of old pain, nothing like the eyes of a successful city surgeon. Everything he had achieved seemed like an empty sound in the face of this internal devastation. One evening, after another sleepless night, he simply couldn't get out of bed. Not physically. He just didn't see the point. Why? Why all this? Why did he run? Why did he study? Why become a doctor? Only to end up here, broken, empty, crushed by memories. His professionalism, his pride, his identity, everything dissolved, leaving only the boy with the broken nose, lying in the dust again. His apartment, bright and modern, felt cold and alien. The walls pressed in. He felt cornered, just like years ago. Only now there was no way out, no path forward. He had reached the summit, but at this summit, glory or peace did not await him, but an encounter with the past that proved more terrifying than any scalpel. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling his world collapse. Not the external one. His career hadn't formally disappeared. His apartment was still his. His inner world was collapsing. That very core he had forged from pain had cracked. He had lost his footing, lost himself. He was at the bottom, in the darkest point of his existence. Breathing was difficult. Every breath brought pain. This was a true fall. A fall into the abyss of despair, where there is no light, no sound, only you and your broken pieces. And it seemed there was no way out of this abyss. This was the culmination of his suffering. Not physical, but spiritual. His home was no longer a refuge, his profession no longer a shield, his past no longer just a memory. Everything merged into a painful, unbearable knot. He was on the brink, devastated, lonely, with a sense of the complete collapse of everything he had ever built. Days blurred into a murky stream. Arthur existed on the edge of reality, as if submerged underwater. The hospital, once his safe harbor, became a place of torture. Every step down the corridors echoed with the past. He avoided the residence lounge, sat in empty offices, or simply wandered, trying to find a corner where the walls didn't press in so hard. His professional errors became more noticeable. Colleagues began whispering, casting worried glances. He knew he was spiraling downwards but couldn't stop. The force that had driven him for years was exhausted, leaving only devastation. But the human spirit is surprisingly resilient. Even at the bottom of the abyss, a faint sprout of light can emerge. One late evening, when the hospital corridors emptied and light glowed only at the duty stations, Arthur found himself near the intensive care unit. Not intentionally. His feet simply led him there. He stopped at the glass door, watching the flickering monitors, the dim light, the bustling nurses. There, behind that glass, lay people whose lives hung by a thread, people who had been saved. His gaze drifted across the rooms, and suddenly froze. He saw him. Jack. He lay in bed, surrounded by tubes and wires, pale, weak, but alive. The monitor beside him displayed steady lines, pulse, pressure, breathing, life. The very life he had held in his hands just days ago. In that moment, something shifted. The hatred, the pain, the humiliation. It was all there. It hadn't vanished. But layered over it, through the haze of suffering, Arthur saw not just Jack, his tormentor. He saw a patient. He saw the person whom he, Arthur, the doctor, had pulled from the clutches of death. His hands, the very hands that had trembled with memories, suddenly seemed distant. They had done their job. They had saved a life. Regardless of whose life it was, regardless of the past, his professionalism, his duty, his years of study and hard work had yielded a result. A life was saved. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation with the past. It was something else, deeper. A realization that his path, his entire difficult, lonely path, had led him here not for revenge, not for triumph over his abuser, but for salvation. To give his skill, his time, his strength to a person who, it seemed, didn't deserve it. He remembered the words of Exupéry he had randomly read years ago. True generosity is giving without expecting anything in return. Back then, those words seemed like a beautiful but abstract phrase. Now, they took on a monstrous, painful reality. He had saved Jack not because he wished him well, not because he had forgiven him, but because he was a doctor, and before him was someone in need of help. It was giving without any, absolutely any, hope of gratitude, of redemption for the past, of anything good in return. It was giving out of pure professional duty, which suddenly felt like something much bigger than just a job. This thought, simple and terrifying in its truthfulness, pierced him like a beam of light. All the pain, all the suffering of the past days couldn't negate one fact. He had saved a person. He had done what he had to do. And in this single undeniable fact, there was a strange, bitter strength. He stood at the door of the ICU, and in that moment, for the first time in many days, he felt not only the weight of the past, but also a lightness in the present. The lightness of duty fulfilled. The lightness of knowing that even in the most difficult circumstances, he had remained true to his calling. A wave of emotions washed over him, not pain, but something new. A mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a quiet, very quiet, astonishment at himself. He, Arthur from Havenwood, who had run from weakness and humiliation, had become the one who fixes what's broken, and he had even fixed the one who broke him. He turned away from the glass. The corridor was dark, but ahead, at the end, a window was visible, through which the faint light of the night city filtered. Not bright, not triumphant, but constant. Light that simply exists, regardless of what happens inside. It was the first deep breath he had taken in a long time. The air still smelled of the hospital, but now the scent didn't cause suffocation. It evoked associations with life, with struggle, with salvation. Arthur didn't suddenly become happy. The pain hadn't completely disappeared. The crack in his inner wall was still there. But light now shone through it, the same light he saw in the corridor window. He realized that his strength lay not in the absence of pain or weakness, but in the ability to act despite them. In the ability to be a doctor even when facing his worst nightmare. Slowly, uncertainly, like a person learning to walk again, he moved down the corridor towards the light. His steps were heavy, but they were his steps. Steps forward. The turning point wasn't a miraculous healing, but acceptance. Accepting his pain as part of himself, but not as the defining force. Accepting that true victory isn't revenge, but creation. Even if you create for the one who destroyed you. He hadn't found forgiveness for Jack, but perhaps something more important. A path towards forgiving himself, that frightened boy who once lay in the dust. Days passed, then a week. Jack Peterson's condition stabilized. The danger passed. He was transferred from the ICU to a regular ward. Physically, he was recovering, but Arthur's inner world was still in turmoil, though not the destructive chaos that followed the surgery. The faint light that had broken through the crack grew slightly brighter, but the darkness of the past still tried to pull him back. He continued to work, but with a new, sharp awareness of the fragility of everything he had achieved. Hospital rumors spread quickly, especially concerning unusual cases. Medical ethics dictate not discussing patients, but human curiosity prevails. The name J. Peterson began to be whispered down the corridors, linked to the young surgeon, Dr. Arthur Vance. Someone on staff heard the last name upon admission. Someone remembered Arthur was from some remote town. Relatives from Havenwood visited Jack, simple, rural folk, unaccustomed to city hospitals. In their conversations, overheard by nurses or orderlies, names, places, hints slipped out. Piece by piece, a mosaic formed. Patient Peterson and Dr. Vance were from the same town. Moreover, there were rumors of some old feud, a long-ago history. Colleagues looked at Arthur with curiosity, mixed with respect and concern. They saw how he had changed over the past week, becoming even more withdrawn, but a new depth had appeared in his eyes, a steely resolve that wasn't there before. His professionalism remained impeccable, but now behind it lay not just detachment, but a conscious choice. The tensest moment came when Jack was cleared for transfer to the general surgery ward and began to fully regain his senses. His consciousness cleared, the pain receded. And then one day, during morning rounds, Arthur entered his room along with the chief of surgery. He saw Jack sitting up in bed, pale, his face gaunt, but with glimmers of his former arrogance in his eyes. Jack looked up at the entering doctors. His gaze slid past the chief, then stopped on Arthur. For a moment, absolute silence hung in the room. A silence thick with the unspoken past. Arthur stood by the bed, tall in his crisp white coat, ID badge on his chest, the embodiment of knowledge and strength. Before him sat Jack, weak, dependent, a scar on his abdomen, a reminder of a life saved. The contrast was stunning. The boy who lay in the dirt, and the man who saved his abuser's life. Jack's face changed visibly. First, casual curiosity towards the doctor. Then, recognition. Slow, disbelieving, replaced by shock. His eyes widened, pupils constricting. A smile that had begun to form twisted into a grimace. He recognized him. Recognized in this tall, confident surgeon the same thin-boned kid he used to torment. Recognized the gaze, not frightened like back then, but cold, piercing, seeing right through him. The chief of surgery began speaking about the patient's condition, recommendations for recovery. Arthur stood beside him, his face impassive. He didn't look away from Jack. It wasn't a battle of stares, just presence. A calm, undeniable presence of a man who had walked his path to the end. Jack tried to say something. The words caught in his throat. He started breathing heavily. His eyes held a mixture of fear, disbelief, and perhaps genuine, piercing shame. He, who had always been strong, who humiliated others, now lay before the man whose life he had once, he thought, broken, and who had given that life back to him. Without words, without reproaches, simply out of duty. The chief finished speaking and turned to Arthur. "Dr. Vance, any additions?" Arthur took a step forward. He didn't approach too closely, maintaining professional distance. He looked at Jack, and his gaze held neither hatred nor triumph, only clarity, as if seeing him for the first time, not the monster from the past, but simply a person. "Condition is stable," Arthur said in an even voice, addressing the chief more than anyone, but the words hung in the air, directed at everyone. His voice was low, calm, the voice of a man in complete control of himself. "It's important to follow all instructions. Rehabilitation will take time, but the prognosis is favorable." He paused briefly. His gaze rested on Jack. And in that pause, in that look, everything was said. Not words about the past, not accusations, just the acknowledgement of what had happened. A life was saved, and the one who saved it was the one he had tried to destroy. "If any questions arise," Arthur continued, now addressing Jack directly, though with the same professional detachment, "ask the nurse on duty or the attending physician." He nodded to the chief and walked out of the room. He didn't look back, left Jack alone with his realization. For Jack, it was a shock, unexpected, crushing. He had expected anything, revenge, reproaches, gloating, but not this calm, professional indifference bordering on mercy. The man he had made an outcast, whom he thought he had broken, became the one who pulled him back from the brink. This act, performed without words, without demanding acknowledgement, without a hint of past grievances, spoke louder than any sermon. For the first time in his life, Jack felt not his superiority, but his own insignificance before the magnitude of another's action. He was saved by the one he had wronged, and it was both punishment and redemption. For Arthur, this wasn't revenge. It was a demonstration, not for Jack, for himself. A demonstration that he hadn't become like his tormentor, that pain hadn't turned him evil, that he had risen above it. He wasn't better than Jack in physical strength or arrogance. He was better in humanity, in the ability to create, not destroy. The truth was revealed not in a loud exposé, but in the quiet fact of a saved life. Justice triumphed not in punishment, but in the abuser finding himself completely dependent on the abused and being saved by his hand. Arthur's reward wasn't Jack's acknowledgement, but inner liberation. He was no longer a prisoner of the past. He was the master of his present and future. The image of the boy from Havenwood with the broken nose and book in hand merged with the image of the confident surgeon in the operating room. It was the same person. But the path traveled between these images was one of transformation, from pain to strength, from despair to duty, from humiliation to dignity. He came to medicine to fix what was broken, and the first thing he fixed was himself, and then, paradoxically, a part of his past in the form of Jack. The days following the visit to Jack's room were strange. The tension that had suffocated Arthur receded, but not immediately. It drained away slowly, like floodwaters after a storm, leaving behind silence and a new, unfamiliar calm. For the first time in many years, he stopped feeling pursued. The ghost of Havenwood no longer stood behind him, whispering humiliations. It sat on a hospital bed, weak and dependent, saved by his own hands. This wasn't triumph or sweet revenge. It was liberation. A vast, painful liberation. He understood that all these years he had been driven not only by a dream, but also by pain. And now, having confronted the source of that pain directly and chosen creation over destruction, the pain lost its power over him. It became part of his history, not its center. The morning after those rounds, Arthur returned home and, for the first time in many weeks, felt real hunger. He ate breakfast calmly, looking out the window at the waking city. The noise of traffic, the first rays of sun on skyscraper windows, it all seemed new, fresh. His apartment no longer felt like a cold prison. It was simply his home. At work, the changes were noticed. Arthur didn't suddenly become talkative or sociable. He remained focused and demanding, but the tension vanished from his face, the dull gaze replaced by a clear, albeit very weary one. Colleagues stopped whispering, replacing anxiety with respect. They saw he had gone through something very difficult and emerged changed, more whole. Jack recovered and was discharged. They never saw each other again. There were no scenes, no confrontations. Jack went back to his Havenwood, carrying not just a scar on his abdomen, but something much deeper, the awareness of the act of the man he considered broken. Perhaps this awareness would change something in him, perhaps not. It didn't matter to Arthur. His act wasn't done for Jack. It was done for himself, for the boy who lay in the dust. To show him that his pain wasn't in vain, that it became fuel for growth, not a poison that corrupted the soul. Arthur continued to operate. Each surgery now held a new meaning for him. It wasn't just a craft, not just a job. It was service, giving. He gave his knowledge, his experience, his strength, expecting nothing in return except the chance to save a life, to alleviate suffering, like when he operated on Jack. That painful lesson became his guiding principle. Often in the evenings, sitting in the silence of his apartment, Arthur thought about his journey, about the remote town, the old library, the pain on the autumn road, the sleepless nights of study, the fears and loneliness. It was all real. It all made him who he was. And it all led him to that moment when he stood over the operating table, choosing between past and future, between revenge and mercy, between destruction and creation. He chose creation, not because it was easy or pleasant, but because it was right, truly, profoundly right. And it was precisely in this choice, in this act of true, unexpected generosity that he found peace. Not complete oblivion of pain, but acceptance of it as part of his path. His life was now not a struggle against the past, but movement through it, towards the light of the operating lamps, the light in the eyes of recovering patients, the light of the new day that peeked into his window each morning. He became the one who fixes what's broken, not just bodies, but perhaps, a little, the very essence of what it means to be human in this world. And therein lay his true strength. Not that he forgot the injury, but that he didn't let it break him, nor did he become a source of evil himself. He chose the path of healing, even for those who had wounded him. And that became his ultimate transformation.